When it comes to having success on the water, having the right rod and reel to get the job done makes a big difference. There's things that baitcasters do well, and there's things that spinning setups do well, and there's also things that either don't do very well. So in today's video, we're going to cover the pros and cons of each and what one I would use in certain situations. Let's get into it. Let's start with spinning reels and why I would recommend them. First of all, they are very beginner friendly. They have an open-faced spool, and there is very little maintenance to do with this reel in terms of casting on the water. Unlike a baitcaster, right, which has your braking system on the side, it's got your spool tension knob. This doesn't have any of those to cast. All you do to cast is open it up and let it fly. That's it. So overall, you're going to get a lot less tangles and backlash, and the learning curve with spinning setups is much, much less than a baitcaster. Now, a baitcaster has a spool in there which is moving, right? You unlock, right? You press down that drag to get that spool to move. Because you have that on a baitcaster and not on a spinning reel is going to be so much easier to use in really windy conditions, as well as for throwing super light lures, because there is absolutely no resistance other than the line hitting the top of the spool as it comes off. So overall, for lighter lures, a spinning setup is going to be a more ideal situation. Another really important thing about spinning setups as well is the price. So typically for a baitcaster, right, at least for a baitcast reel, under $100, there's not going to be a whole ton of options, and a lot of those options are not going to be very high quality, versus on spinning setups, there are spinning reels in between $50 to $100 that I would actually call a mid-range or a mid-budget reel, versus baitcasters, there is nothing below $100 I would call mid-budget. So overall, I think you get more bang for your buck out of a spinning setup than a baitcaster. Now, because of the way a baitcaster is built, it definitely favors precision, power, and efficiency, which is why experienced anglers love using baitcast setups. There's a lot of advantages to them. You can use them in both fresh and salt. However, I would say the most common uses for a baitcaster, especially one like this, is going to be in the bass fishing industry, as well as for your steelhead and salmon stuff. That is becoming very popular as well. Because when you cast a baitcaster, you're able to stop your thumb whenever you want to completely stop that bait at a certain spot, or you're able to adjust your spool to let out a certain amount of line as you cast. Accuracy is a very big thing with baitcasters, and this is why a lot of professional bass fishermen will use these when fishing on their boats in tournaments. If you've ever seen online, like, a Major League Fishing or, like the Bassmaster Elite Series, you'll see, obviously, those guys are using baitcasters because they're trying to put their lures in very specific spots that they think a fish is going to be, and they can put it in each of those spots very quickly. They can cover an entire bank in a couple minutes just because of that power and efficiency that you could not get if you were using a spinning setup. The other thing with the baitcaster is how you hold the reel. Not only you get that efficiency and that, that castability, that accuracy, but you also get more power with this. The way you're able to hold this and crank down, right? You can crank using, more weight as leverage, versus on a spinning rod, you don't have that same level of power. There's also a couple features with baitcasters that you cannot get onto a spinning reel. One of those is a line counter reel, which you guys will be seeing right here in the video. This is something that you would use for trolling, which you're just putting lines right behind the boat. So say you want to fish 100 feet behind the boat. Yes, with the spinning setup, right, you could take your hand and you could do, 100 of these, right? It's about a foot of line. You could let out 100 of those and know you're about 100 feet. However, with a baitcast trolling setup, you have your line counter up here. You just click that down, let the line go behind the boat, and it will count that for you. So it's second you're at 100 feet, you click that over, and boom, you're exactly 100 feet behind the boat, and it's very efficient to do it that way. So there are a couple features where, especially with trolling, I very rarely troll with spinning gear. I think trolling with baitcast gear just makes a huge difference in that type of fishing. Now, knowing the information we do about each reel, let's go over a bunch of scenarios, the most likely scenarios that you are doing for fishing, and which one I would prefer to use for that situation. For the first one here, beginner fisherman, hands down, a spinning reel is going to be the play. Like I said before, they are easier to cast. There is much less of a learning curve in trying to figure these out. They're much easier in terms of maintenance factor, as well as you're most likely not going to be throwing giant lures right off the bat. You're probably fishing for bass, bluegill, trout, something more on the, not that it's trout fishing's a beginner thing, right? But in terms of, it's a much easier thing to get into than like heavy offshore saltwater, right? This is going to be most likely the first thing you fish for. So spinning setups are going to be the better way to do that because you're probably throwing lighter lures. Now for an experienced fisherman, I put down bait cast and spin. And the reason why I said that is because as an experienced fisherman, you know which one you're going to need for that certain scenario. If someone says, hey, which one do you fish with? Are you a spin guy or a bait cast guy? They're not going to answer that question because they're going to tell you, no, it depends on what you're doing. I have both setups, and depending on what fish I'm going for, or depending on how I'm fishing for that species, I'm going to use one or the other, right? It's not a clear cut, there's a winner, there's one that's better. They know that there's certain situations that both excel in. Now, for trout and panfish, I do think there is a definite winner, and that is going to be a spinning reel. The reason why I say that is because most of the time you're using lighter lures for those fish. You're, small panther martins or little crappie jigs, a bobber and a worm. You're using lighter setups, and you're typically not going to use a bait caster to cast those light setups. Also, you don't really need a ton of power with these fish, right? Power is not the highest priority, so you don't need that bait caster to be able to lock them down, and bring them in. Like, you're gonna have no problem bringing them in anyway. Now, for the same reasons I talked about in the trout/panfish category, I would also say for finesse bass fishing, I think spin is also the way to go. You're typically gonna be throwing lighter lures in this case, right? Maybe, super small Senkos, Ned rigs, tiny little swim baits, drop shots, right? Small shaky heads, certain lures that are very light. And I would prefer to throw that on a spinning setup versus a bait cast setup. Now for general bass fishing, spin I think is not the way to go. I think a bait caster is the way to do it because for bass fishing, efficiency and power is the name of the game. You want to cover a lot of water, throw a lot of lures, and get the highest chance of you putting that bait in front of the fish's face, right? That is your goal. And a bait caster does that 20 times better than a spinning rod does, especially, if you're fishing certain things, like if you're flipping, you're doing situations where you are trying to be very accurate and you're trying to get it in a certain spot, cast after cast after cast. Baitcaster is hands down the way to go on that. Also, your heavier lures, right? Like your big chatterbaits, jigs, some of your bigger topwater, large swim baits, all of that type of stuff, you won't be able to efficiently use it on a spin setup most of the time. A bait caster, you're going to be way better with. You're going to get better casts. You're going to get more power when the fish actually strikes. Overall, you're going to be very happy you were using a bait caster versus a spinning setup. Now, because a bait caster excels in accuracy and a spinning setup excels more in that casting distance, I would say a spin setup is better for overall bank fishing. And the reason why I say that is because if you're on the bank, you're not able to access everywhere that someone with a boat can, right? Especially if you're on a local pond or something. It's a pretty big pond. There's a little island in the middle of the lake and you want to try to get right next to that island. You want to bomb a cast and get right out in front of it. You're going to have a better chance with a spinning setup than you are a bait caster. Now, there are some exceptions to that for you pond hopping guys that like to throw, frogs and Senkos, especially you guys down south, Texas, Florida, even California, a lot of that stuff. A bait caster is going to be the better way to go if you're fishing for bass like that, fishing weeds, thick structure, where you're going to need more power, right? You don't have a boat to be able to work that fish and bring him out, right? With a spinning setup, man, I've done that before. I fished a spinning setup in the weeds. Not fun. You have no power, no torque to get that fish out, right? So in that case, for you pond hoppers, baitcaster is the way to go. But for overall bank fishing, no matter what species, I still think spinning is the way to go. Now, for ice fishing, spin is definitely the best way to go, in my opinion. You will see probably 99% of anglers on the ice using a spinning reel. I know a buddy of mine that uses baitcasters and he uses them very efficiently on the ice. However, I just don't think it's the way to go in most situations, especially if you're throwing really light lures lures. There is an inline reel, which is a very ice fishing specific thing, and those definitely have their pros, but they also have their cons as well. And I think overall, I think a spin is the better way to go for ice fishing. Now for inshore saltwater, whether you're off the beach, you're on a boat fishing small bays, whether you're in Florida fishing for speckled trout or you're off the California coast fishing for striper, right? Overall, I think a spinning setup is going to be your better bet for inshore fishing because you need that distance. A lot of times, you're on the beach or you're on the boat and a big old bait pile, there's a big old school of fish, blowing up on bait 60 yards out, right? And you've got to be able to try to bomb your setup as far as you can and get it on that fish. Spin is the way to go on that. You need that distance. Spin is going to be spin is going to be the best way to get to that spot, unless you're throwing extremely heavy lures on a baitcaster. But then again, those super just bomb casts where you're putting all your effort into it, that's when you're more likely to backlash a baitcaster, and then you're at a commission picking out a backlash and you've got a big school of fish blowing up that you could be catching. You're not going to have that problem on a spin setup. So that's why I say for inshore saltwater, overall, spin is the way to go. Now for steelhead and salmon fishing, I think baitcaster is the way to go. Now you can obviously there's tons of situations where a spin is an awesome way to do it. However, for salmon and steelhead, you need power. You need to be efficient, especially if you're on a river, right? And you're casting it out, you're letting it drift all the way down, you're picking it up and casting it again. You don't want to have to do all those extra movements with a spinning setup. You want to be able to just reel it in, pick it up, cast, boom, you're ready to go. You want that power, and you're also going to get faster gear ratios on a baitcaster than you are a spinning rod. So, you're able to pick up more line faster with this versus on a spinning setup. And with salmon and steelhead, you have to be able to do that. If you guys watch a lot of steelhead and salmon videos online, you'll see a lot of people switching over to baitcasters. That's definitely the trend right now, and I see why it is. Trolling is another one where you're going to see a majority of guys using baitcast setups. You're going to see line counter reels like the Dio Alexa. I think Akuma Coldwater has some really good ones as well. There's a lot of different line counter baitcast reels that are going to get that job done more effectively. You want to know how far the line is behind the boat. You want to be able to just quickly, let that line out. Boom, click that line. You've got your drag right here. Your drag is very easy to adjust if you're fighting a fish or you're putting your rod in the rod holder. And it's very easy to pick up out of the rod holder and immediately start fighting a fish. You have a lot more power and accuracy and efficiency when you pick up that rod. So overall, hands down, trolling, baitcasters are the best option. Now for big game, if you're on the bank, spin is going to be the better way to do it. A lot of those guys that do bank fishing for sturgeon are typically using big spinning setups. But if you are targeting big game fish on a boat, whether it's sturgeon, striper, catfish, gar, whatever it is in that situation, baitcasters are probably going to be the way to go. And the reason why is because you get that power, right? You have so much more power and hold on the fish. And if you're on a boat, you don't need to cast extremely far. Most likely, you parked your boat, you're 20, 30 yards off of the spot that you're wanting to drop your bait onto. So all it's going to take is a little pitch and your bait is out there, right? You don't have to do this big sling cast. It's just so much easier to do that with the baitcaster than it is a spinning setup. And once you hook that fish, you have more power. If there is a technique that you disagreed with on my video, please let me know down in the comments. Or if there's one that I forgot about and you have an opinion on which one you think would be better for a new technique, let me know in the comments. I'd love to pin your comment and get a discussion with you so that other people can, listen in too and get our opinions on everything. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's episode, and we'll see you guys next time on Humbug Videos.